Sigmund Freud is widely considered to be one of the most influential thinkers of the 20th century. But what motivated Freud and his theories? Born to a Jewish family in Austria in 1856, Freud's life and work was driven by a strong Jewish identity. In his first major work, The Interpretation of Dreams, first released in German in 1899, Freud describes his childhood discovery that he was a member of an alien race, and his identification with Hannibal as a Semitic commander determined to conquer Rome, which to Freud symbolized Christian society and the cultural dominance of the Catholic Church. By early childhood, Freud would frequently fantasize about taking revenge against all anti-Semites. Viewing Christian authority as the main obstacle to full Jewish integration, Freud adopted the liberal worldview because, as Jewish Freud biographer Peter Gay puts it, it was good for the Jews. In reality, Catholicism didn't serve as much of a barrier to Jewish power. Jewish novelist Jacob Wasserman would describe Vienna in the late 19th century by noting that all public life was dominated by the Jews. The banks, the press, the theater, literature, social functions, all was in the hands of the Jews. Nor was Freud interested in an integration with Gentile society. By the time he was a student at the University of Vienna, Freud had abandoned any pretense of assimilation, deciding that isolation as a Jew would serve him well. By 1886, he described himself as neither Austrian nor German, but as a Jew. Privately, Freud would speak of the superiority of the Jewish race, and in Moses and Monotheism, he would write that beneath their thin Christian veneer, Gentiles are the same polytheistic barbarians they have always been. In 1897, Freud would join the B'nai B'rith Jewish fraternal order so that he could feel welcomed by like-minded Jews. B'nai B'rith, a Jewish supremacist organization, would go on to found the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, the powerful Jewish organization now commonly known as the ADL. How did Freud intend to conquer Rome? By subverting Christian sexual morality. By 1893, Freud had identified sexuality as the primary cause of neuroses and prescribed healthy sexuality to society, which he defined as free sexual intercourse between unmarried young men and women. He would later write, "Sexual morality as society, and at its most extreme, American society, defines it, seems very despicable to me. I stand for a much freer sexual life." By the logic of Freud's arguments, the lack of sublimation of instincts would cause the rapid disintegration of civilization. It is very telling that Freud was prescribing this loosening of moral restraints, not to the Jewish community that he identified with, but to the Gentile society he felt alien from, and had fantasized about conquering since he was a child. By the early 1900s, Freud had collected an inner circle of followers, spawning the early psychoanalytic movement. The inner circle of the movement was entirely Jewish, and Gentiles in the psychoanalytic movement were treated as outsiders that could never truly belong. But for psychoanalysis to become respected as a real science in the global community, Freud thought it necessary to have a Gentile frontman to lead the psychoanalytic movement. The man he picked for the job was Swiss psychiatrist Carl Jung. In a letter to Karl Abraham, who was heading the German wing of the psychoanalytic movement from Berlin, Freud writes that Jung's arrival on the scene had helped psychoanalysis escape the danger of becoming a Jewish national affair. Freud also points out that while Abraham naturally follows Freud's ideas because of their Jewish racial kinship, the Gentile Jung had found his way to Freud only through great inner resistances. Naturally, having Jung as the face of psychoanalysis would be essential to overcoming the inner resistances of the wider Gentile society to this Jewish movement. As Freud would write to Abraham, our Aryan comrades are really completely indispensable to us. Otherwise, psychoanalysis would succumb to anti-Semitism. Freud would end up being surprised by the inability of Gentile society to recognize psychoanalysis as a hostile Jewish attack. During his only trip to America in 1909, Freud responded to the waving crowds greeting his ship by saying to Jung, "Don't they know we are bringing them the plague?" After the eventual falling out between Freud and Jung in 1912, over Jung coming to doubt the validity of Freud's sexual theories, including infantile sexuality. Freud would change his mind about gentile involvement in psychoanalysis. He would write to Sándor Ferenczi, who was the Hungarian representative of psychoanalysis in Budapest, that Jung must now be in florid neurosis. However this turns out, my intention of amalgamating Jews and Goyim in the service of psychoanalysis seems now to have gone awry. They are separating like oil and water.